Stephen Hawking was not a mystic. He didn't read stars. He didn't hear voices. He listened to equations, and they told him something terrifying. He spent his life chasing answers to questions most people are too afraid to ask. What happens inside a black hole? What existed before time? Why are we here at all? But in the final chapter of his life, Hawking turned his gaze from the stars to us, and what he saw was not enlightenment, it was extinction. He warned of a future where Earth becomes uninhabitable, where artificial intelligence grows too fast, too powerful, and forgets who built it, where humanity becomes obsolete, and where civilization burns, not by war, but by its own unstoppable hunger. These were not the warnings of a conspiracy theorist. They were the calculations of the man who once made the cosmos whisper. And now, one by one, his prophecies are coming true. So what exactly did Stephen Hawking predict? Why did he believe we only had a century left? And what happens if he was right? This is not just a story about science. It's a final message from the edge of reason, one we were never meant to ignore. In the vast timeline of human history, some dates seem to echo with strange meaning. January 8, 1642, Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science, breathed his last. Exactly 300 years later, on January 8, 1942, in the quiet city of Oxford, England, another child entered the world. His name, Stephen William Hawking. Coincidence? Or destiny written in the fabric of time? Galileo was the first to challenge the heavens with a telescope. Stephen would later challenge existence itself, not with lenses, but with the mind. Born into a home where intellect was sacred and curiosity had no limits, Hawking's childhood was far from ordinary. His father, a renowned tropical disease expert, was often away. His mother, a philosopher, filled the house with ideas instead of rules. It was cold in winter, but inside burned the quiet fire of thought. No one talked about careers or fame or money. They talked about questions, big ones. The kind that never had easy answers. In that old, book-filled house, young Stephen learned something few classrooms ever teach: to question everything, to doubt every answer, to stare into the unknown and not blink. By 17, he was at Oxford, not as a dreamer but as a quiet storm. While others studied all night, Stephen studied just an hour a day, and still, he saw further than most professors ever could. One day, when given math problems from a textbook, he refused to solve them. Instead, he returned the next class to explain line by line why the textbook was wrong. But just as his brilliance began to rise, fate struck. At 21, Stephen was diagnosed with ALS, a disease that slowly shuts down the body, one nerve at a time. Doctors gave him 2 years to live, 2 years to say goodbye, 2 years before silence, but Stephen didn't die. Instead, he began to see further. What do you do when the world tells you you're dying? Most people crumble, most people fade, but Stephen Hawking, I woke up. ALS came like a silent thief. One day he was walking, the next stumbling. Then came the diagnosis, a rare, merciless disease. No cure, no mercy, just time dripping away. But instead of breaking him, it rewired him. If his body would betray him, then he would live inside his mind. At first, there was despair. He withdrew. He stopped speaking. He refused to plan a future he believed he wouldn't live to see, but love found him. A woman named Jane Wilder, strong, brilliant, and unshaken, gave him something medicine couldn't. Hope, with her by his side, Hawking chose to fight, not against the disease, but against time itself. While others measured their days by clocks and calendars, Stephen measured his in equations, in paradoxes, in the gravity of black holes and the birth of time. And then came the idea that would make him immortal. In 1965, while searching for a doctoral thesis, he came across a paper by physicist Roger Penrose. It spoke of black holes, mysterious, violent points in space where the rules of reality collapse. Hawking's mind lit up. He joined Penrose. Together, they redefined the beginning of everything. They discovered that if you reversed the math of a black hole, you got the Big Bang. Not just an explosion, but a singularity. A place where space and time were once crushed into a single, infinite point. It was no longer just theory. It was origin, but Hawking wasn't done. In 1974, he made a claim so bold it shook the world of physics. He said black holes were not entirely black. They glowed. They emitted energy. They slowly evaporated like whispers of fire in the void. The phenomenon was named after him, Hawking radiation. From the edge of nothingness, he had pulled light. His mentor, Dennis Sciama, called it one of the most beautiful and moving contributions in the history of physics. Stephen Hawking had found a way to speak, not with his voice, but with the universe, and the universe answered. In 1985, the silence came, not metaphorically, literally. A sudden pneumonia struck him during a trip to Europe. His lungs, already fragile, collapsed. Doctors had two choices: let him die or cut open his throat and take away his voice forever. They chose life, but life with a price. When Hawking awoke, he could no longer speak. Not a whisper, not a cry, not even a breath with meaning. For most, that would be the end, the final wall, but not for him. Because the voice that had once explained black holes would now return through a machine, a tiny sensor attached to his cheek, a computer mounted to his wheelchair, and through slight movements, just twitches, he began to build sentences again. Ideas, books, theories. His new voice was robotic, synthetic, metallic, but unmistakable, flat in tone, but infinite in depth, and somehow even more powerful than before, because now, every word was a choice, every phrase was deliberate, every pause was sacred. Then came 1988. While the world was still trying to understand his discoveries, he released something unexpected, a brief history of time. It was not written for scientists, it was written for us. For the curious, the seekers, the ones who had stared into the sky and asked, why? In it, Hawking guided readers from Einstein's relativity to quantum mechanics, from the beginning of the universe to the mystery of time itself. It sold over 25 million copies, was translated into dozens of languages, and turned the phrase black hole into a household term. Stephen Hawking didn't just teach physics, he made the cosmos feel personal. He followed with more books, The Universe in a Nutshell, The Grand Design, My Brief History, each one a ladder not to the stars but to understanding, and all of this from a man who couldn't move, who couldn't speak, but who refused to be silent. He had done something no machine could do. He had turned limitation into legend. In the final years of his life, Stephen Hawking stopped looking only at the stars and started looking at us. He had spent decades decoding the cosmos, but now he saw something far more terrifying. Not in the distant galaxies, but in the mirror. He began to speak, not just as a physicist, but as a prophet of probability, a man whose warnings came not from faith but from mathematics, and what he saw coming shook the world. First, he warned of climate collapse, not centuries from now, not someday, but soon. He believed Earth could become another Venus, a scorched wasteland of acid rain, 250 degrees C heat, and skies no life could breathe. A chain reaction triggered by human greed. He saw the balance tipping and the fall inevitable. Second, he said humanity would need to leave Earth, not as an adventure, but as a necessity. By the year 2600, he predicted our planet would become unlivable. Overpopulation, resource depletion, conflict, collapse. If we didn't find another world, we wouldn't survive this one. He looked toward Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system, and urged scientists to build ships, to prepare, to run. Third, he warned of artificial intelligence, but not like in movies. There would be no killer robots, no dramatic rebellion, just a quiet takeover. He said, "If you build a dam and it destroys an anthill, it's not because you hate ants. Your goals simply don't align." That, he feared, is how AI would erase us, not with malice, but with indifference. Fourth, he predicted a rise of genetically enhanced superhumans. Through CRISPR and gene editing, he believed the rich and powerful would begin upgrading themselves. Smarter, stronger, longer lived, and once that begins, the gap would widen. Those who remain natural would become obsolete or worse, expendable. And fifth, his final, most chilling prophecy, that by the year 2600, Earth would become a fireball, not metaphorically, literally. He imagined our cities burning, our oceans boiling, our civilization gone, not by one single disaster, but by everything all at once. Overheating, overconsumption, overconfidence, a planet pushed past its breaking point, not by nature, but by its most intelligent species. And as terrifying as it sounds, Hawking wasn't trying to scare us. He was trying to wake us up. These weren't visions from a dream. They were projections from a chalkboard, numbers, logic, truth, and now, decades later, some of them are already happening. Stephen Hawking was born into a Christian family, but he didn't inherit belief. He questioned it, measured it, dismantled it, and in the ruins, he found something far more radical. Not that God didn't exist, but that he wasn't needed. Hawking didn't claim to disprove God. He simply showed how the universe could create itself. In his later years, especially in the grand design, he made a bold claim: the laws of physics, by themselves, were enough. He explained it through something called negative energy. Imagine building a hill. You scoop earth from the ground to pile it up. The hill is positive. The hole you dug, negative. Together, they cancel out. That, he said, is how the universe began. The Big Bang created matter, space, time, all positive energy. But it also created an equal and opposite void, negative energy. The result, zero, a perfect balance. So if the total energy of the universe is zero, then nothing, literally nothing, is required to begin it. No divine hand, no grand architect, just a law, a spark, a ripple in the silence. And what about time? Hawking believed that before the Big Bang, time did not exist, not even as a dimension, not even as a concept, if there was no before. Then there could be no creator who acted before, because before didn't exist. It was a logic loop with no exit, no need for gods, just gravity. To many, these ideas felt like heresy. To others, liberation. But one thing was certain: he didn't arrive there through rebellion. He arrived through reason. And strangely, his worldview wasn't entirely at odds with ancient Eastern thought, like yin and yang, opposites that complete each other, positive and negative, existence and emptiness, balance. He saw the universe not as a creation, but as a consequence, not as a gift, but as a phenomenon, not divine, but inevitable. And perhaps that's what made his predictions so haunting. They didn't come from a prophet. They came from a man who believed only in laws and saw those laws leading to our end. March 14, 2018. The voice that once made the universe speak fell silent. Stephen Hawking had passed away. On the same date, Albert Einstein was born. As if the cosmos, in its strange poetic rhythm, had planned a perfect symmetry. A mind exits as another once entered. But Hawking didn't just leave behind theories. He left behind a mirror. One that forces us to look not up into the stars, but inward, at our choices, at our future, at how close we might be to the edge. He was supposed to die young. He lived over 5 decades past his deadline. He was supposed to lose his voice forever. Instead, he gave voice to a universe that had never been heard. He didn't ask us to believe blindly. He asked us to think bravely. He didn't demand faith. He demanded responsibility. And though he often said there was no need for a God, his message still had the weight of prophecy. Not a divine revelation, but a scientific warning. Now the burden is ours. The questions are no longer his to ask, they are ours to answer. Will we continue this blind race toward extinction, or will we evolve not by gene or machine, but by awareness? Stephen Hawking believed in the power of knowledge to save us. The question is, do we? If today's story made you pause and wonder, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next video.